Hi, and welcome to CryptoBiography. I'm your host, Brandon Starr. This is episode 78, Annie and the Magician, Part 4. I'm enjoying writing this. It's one of the fun things I have is because Annie is also using the name Anastasia, finding out when it's appropriate to use which name. Of course, I can't do that with the title. I can't just blithely switch it from Annie and the Magician to Anastasia and the Magician, at least not back and forth. I might switch it at one point and make it permanent, but anyway. It's been very interesting to write so far. Last episode, we found out that Quarere the Magician was very close to coming up with a healing ether, and why he felt that would put both him and her in danger to certain powers who would be very interested in having that that power exclusive to themselves and to their military especially. And if you have any comments or questions about this episode or previous episodes, cryptobiography@gmail.com, or hit us up on Facebook or Twitter. Here we go. Soon after, Quarere gave Anastasia a coat much like his. "Partly you will find it functional," Quarere said by way of explanation, "and partly you will find it socially helpful." "Socially?" Annie asked. Quarere nodded. "If there's one thing people can't stand, it's other people they knew back when they were low, climbing the ladder," he said. "That is why you haven't been coming with me to meals. Everyone would immediately talk and say how the kitchen girl is now propped up like a princess, eating with the upper class. Well, some of that can't be helped. It would be easier if we were going to a new city. You could be whomever you like then, but here people will know you. However, if you have a coat like mine, it will signal to them that you were like me. Many of their complaints will die in their throat." Annie nodded her understanding. She went to dinner with him that night, and it was as he said. A few people whom she had known in the kitchens did look at her sideways, and some of them even looked angry. But everyone else was happy to be introduced to her as Anastasia. She asked him about this. "Weren't you going to hold off letting people know I have changed?" "When I saw the situation down there, I changed my mind," Quarere replied. "Even I underestimated the ignorance the wealthy have of the lower classes. No one other than the servers, I could tell, recognized you at all. So I changed my pace and introduced you as Anastasia. And so Anastasia you are to them. Perhaps one of their servants will try to pull their sleeve and say, 'No, you are Annie from the kitchens.' But that will hardly matter. The wealthy do not concern themselves with the opinions of the poor. It was a lesson I have learned before, but had to have strengthened." "But I am Annie from the kitchens," Annie replied. "No, never think that again. When it comes to such matters, you are who you say you are and who you hold yourself to be." Quarere was sterner than she had seen him, even when she had a mistake with her chores. "Thinking of yourself as anything less than Anastasia around such people will invite them to think of you that way, and that you must not allow." Annie nodded. "And we must get you completely new clothing. I do not want anyone out from here ever seeing you in your kitchen clothing again. I will take care of that tomorrow. Until then, if you must go out, please always wear your coat." Annie nodded again. The next time they ate in the dinner hall, it was a special occasion. "King Leopold will be there," advised Quarere. "I'm sure you know all that means." "I will keep my mouth shut unless asked a direct question," Anastasia replied. "Good idea," Quarere said with a half smile. They arrived, Anastasia in the best of her new dresses plus her coat to make it like a uniform, part of Quarere's coterie. Though not a subject of King Leopold, Quarere was recognized as being the magician in residence. Thus, he and Anastasia sat at the head table, not far from the king himself. Leopold arrived last, with a few people. Quarere stiffened when he saw them. Anastasia looked up at Quarere. He had taken out a small phial and was dabbing the contents on his face, humming under his breath. Quarere noticed her looking and said, "I'll tell you later." Anastasia thought about this and decided to learn as much as she could about the strangers who came in with King Leopold. This wasn't much, mostly their faces at first. But King Leopold soon brought them over to introduce them to Quarere. "My dear Quarere," King Leopold said. "Your Highness," Quarere said, having stood up, clearly knowing what was about to happen, gave a neat little bow. Anastasia kept her head down, but was looking out the corner of her eye as much as she could. "May I introduce a traveling magician, Cupigula," King Leopold said. Leopold was a large man in every direction, with a huge, fancy mustache and beard past his collarbones. The magician he was introducing, Cupigula, was tall, taller than the large Leopold and far taller than the relatively short Quarere, and thin, with no mustache but a narrow beard like an arrow pointing downward below his mouth. "How nice to meet you," Quarere said, and held out his hand. Cupigula shook it with a sort of appraising look in his eye. The rest of the people who had come in were standing behind Leopold and Cupigula, but were not introduced. Anastasia assumed that they were attendants or perhaps apprentices, as she was also not introduced in turn. "Likewise," said Cupigula, "we should meet to exchange what techniques we may." He said in a tone that made Anastasia doubt that he wanted to do any such thing, but was perhaps expected to offer it. "Of course," Quarere replied. After a brief, slightly awkward moment, King Leopold said, "Let us eat," to the room as a whole, and everyone cheered. Leopold, Cupigula, and his entourage sat at the head of the table, and Anastasia reached for some dark bread that had been put on the table just before the king's entrance. "Well done," Quarere said quietly to Anastasia a few moments later, when the buzz of conversation in the room had made it difficult to be overheard. "But I didn't do anything," Anastasia replied. "Precisely. Sometimes doing nothing is the best thing you can do." Anastasia thought about this and decided it made sense. They ate the meal in relative silence, and Anastasia noticed Quarere reapplying the ether halfway through as surreptitiously as possible. When it was over, they went straight back to Quarere's rooms. When they were inside, Quarere motioned for her to remain quiet. He applied some sort of ether to the door, then turned to her. "We are in danger," he said. Her stomach, filled with wonderful food, did a flip. "What were those ethers you used?" Anastasia asked. "The one on the door prevents people from hearing through it. I wanted to make sure that, if we were followed by Cupigula or his people, we could speak in safety. I don't think we were followed, but it is difficult to be sure. The first one is my anti-stranger ointment. I put it on my face, and unless someone knows me already, my features appear as something other than they are to them. It wouldn't work on you or King Leopold, but fortunately I've kept my face and, until tonight, my name away from Cupigula." "What makes him a danger?" Annie said. She was feeling very small now, very scared, and not at all like Anastasia, the powerful apprentice. "I learned about him a couple of years ago. He was doing magic in a way altogether different from me. Altogether different." Quarere trailed off, and that scared Annie more than anything else had. "What is it?" she asked. "You know how the ethers are more powerful for the magician who creates them than for anyone else?" Annie nodded. "Well, that incentivizes magicians to use their own ether as much as possible. Why would I use anyone else's when I can get a fraction of the effect, right?" Annie nodded again. "Well, wrong. I thought so too. Still do, really. But Cupigula has figured out a new system. He has found a way to make almost anyone make raw ether themselves. He then takes that and makes massive amount of ether for him to use. Weaker effects matter less if you have such huge amounts that you can splash it around like spring water." "Does he hire these people to make raw ether?" Annie asked. "Hires? No, he enslaves. He decided it was too expensive to pay, say, by the dram. If he paid, they could perhaps find other magicians to sell their ether to, and either drive up the price or reduce his supply. So he enslaves them." "Where?" "In Gardmore." Even Annie had heard of it. The large kingdom to the east had a capital, enormous compared to every other city. There were many rumors of what happened there. It was a place of wonder and of danger. Though its reputation had probably tarnished in the retelling, she would not put slavery past the denizens of Gardmore. "How many people has he enslaved?" Annie asked. "I don't know for sure, but dozens, perhaps scores." And that would make him more powerful than you. In many ways, yes. What are we going to do? I am close to finding the last ingredient for my healing ether. I can't leave. But I can't take a chance with him around. I'm going to ground. I will have to hide for a while until he moves on. Will you be able to move around the castle since you used your stranger ether at dinner? Quarere thought, no, anyone else in that room would have known me and could describe me to him, or I could go out and someone who knows me could hail me with him or his confederates around. This will be a good time to just practice my art here in my room. We will have to have food brought up to us, and I will simply teach you day and night. Anastasia, now feeling excited at the prospect of so much advancement, nodded with vigor. And that's where we're going to end this week. If you have comments or questions about this episode or previous episodes, cryptobiography@gmail.com, or hit us up on Facebook or Twitter. Thanks for listening. Words and music, copyright 2018, CryptoBiography LLC, all rights reserved.